to welcome everyone to our construction forum today, Reimagining the Office and Work Life After COVID-19. My name is Anna Christie. I'm the Chief Executive at the Sussex Chamber of Commerce. So we have got three speakers today. We're joined firstly by Julian Church, who's the Director of Julian Church and Associates. So he's very experienced in restaurant, cafe, bar fit-outs, and they can apply fast-track approaches to general construction, where they work within the educational, office fit-out, residential development and medical sectors, with also general commercial or community sectors. So I'd firstly like to introduce and welcome Julian.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Anna. Good to see everyone. Okay, so the sort of title today was Reimagining the Office and Work Life After COVID. I've related this to the office as well as sort of restaurants and retail. It's not original, what I'm telling you at the moment. It's been pulled from many reports and articles and comments and presentations that I've been through, but it's more for information, and I hope it adds to the sort of conversation for today and beyond. COVID is an accelerator of pre-existing trends in the marketplace, and with that there is I followed some stuff by Seth Godin and things like that, and I think he summed it up very well the other week when he said there is no new normal because that's definitive. It's simply that the normal of now, and that's how we've got to deal with it and how we move on. And to win in this normal, we need to sort of really embrace innovation and strategy and business modelling. So it's what's coming through and the trends that we've seen, how we use those to accelerate where we're going through. So just to give you some sort of ideas of what's going on at the moment, the Office for National Statistics put out their latest sort of quarterly GDP figures, showed that construction was actually the hardest hit sector of the economy in Q2. With that, the whole of the construction sector has actually contracted by 35%, with a sharp 40% fall in April. There's been 2 months of minor sort of comeback on that, but we're still well down on where we would have came into this year. I think, just as an aside, Building Magazine said this week that tenders in August were actually 70% down like for like on this time last year. So it gives you an idea of where we're trading at the moment in what we're doing. If you want to have a look at construction new order data for Q2, new orders fell 51.1% compared to Q1. And across the EU, we're seeing in March 2020 this year that construction business had actually decreased by 12% and has been dropping through. If you're looking for construction output in the UK, the best expected results for this year is actually for a 25% decrease, is the best case scenario. So that affects us all. It affects cash flow. It affects all construction businesses and what we're doing. But what I want to concentrate now on is more the specifics of how it actually affects it in a people, physical and sort of digital space for each of the pieces that we go through. So if we could just drop down to the next slide, please, Anna. We come into the office, and initially what we're looking at with the office as we come through. So if we could just drop one more, if that's okay, Anna. People, how it's affected people and how we work within the office. The mass working from home has definitely got benefits, and this has seen a sort of shift in the business, with up to 80% of people reportedly enjoying working from home, with 41% of people saying that they're being more productive. 50% of the UK workforce would now favour working from home, apparently, for at least 1 or 2 days a week. You've seen changed working patterns and staggered breaks, so changes in the working hours. You're seeing reduced business trips and certainly reduced face-to-face interactions. We might have done this as a face-to-face today, but now we're all suddenly getting used to this, looking through the computer at each other. The work environment's going to have to be flexible, and it's a key driver in how we provide our work environment, in how we can retain staff and sustain staff with interaction. Physically, the physical working environment in what we're looking at, the worker pressure to reduce the commute time is there. in sort of overcrowded city hubs, we can see an office sort of shift from the cities potentially out to the regions and the geographics as we move out. Social distancing around the office has eliminated queuing in reception areas and things like lifts and things like that. As we go through, we're going to have to plan that more in the future in how we actually work. And the other thing, which I think is quite important, is increased ventilation and upgraded HVAC installations. There's a lot of talk around washing your hands and that sort of thing in terms of COVID, but also small doses of COVID is held in the air, and a large time exposure to that will actually help increase the sort of capture rate of that from what we're going through. In terms of remote working, it's a strategy of why employees want to go into the office and how often they need to go into the office. Can we all work from home and hot desk while we're in the office, or do we all need dedicated desk space when we actually get into there? So, and then you've got to think about maintaining a sort of social distance spaces between desks. So the volume and density of desks going forwards is likely to be less. And we've got a job in the city with a client. We were looking to put 250 desks in there. They're now only planning to put 60 in, and that's for a long-term trend going forwards with them. Workers are going to visit the office less frequently. We've already said that, but there's the requirement really for you to collaborate and create together, and certainly sort of, I believe, sort of younger working colleagues and that sort of thing like to actually sort of bounce off ideas off and design sort of studios and things like that. They're looking to bounce your ideas through. So I think those sort of companies will actually get together a little bit more, but there's certainly a idea of working remotely, and that can change the whole sort of difference in sort of work-life integration and how people conceive their office space and what you want to do. And working from home should theoretically give you more time to actually enjoy working and then enjoy your time away. In terms of digitally, what we've actually seen is a rapid change in how we actually interface with each other. As I say, we would have been a face-to-face meeting normally today in doing this previously, whereas this is possibly the way forward for the very, very long term. You've got rapid change in technology and video conferencing and other forms of digital collaboration. Digital tracking and monitoring to track the office use will most likely come in further. So what I'm talking about there is things like sensors to review heavily trafficked areas, that you're sensing how much use an actual office area is getting. That will then dictate how often it needs cleaning and the regularity of cleaning and things like that, and or servicing and bits that go through with that sort of thing. We're looking in terms of company culture. There's a big change with the digital coming in there, in that how much we value and trust the output that we're getting versus the physical idea of you actually being there and present. Okay, moving on to staffing in terms of the office. There's a work-life balance I've already touched very briefly on. Greater time flexibility through reduced commuting time. I know that when I worked in London previously, when I cut out my commute at that time, that gave me the opportunity to take up some hobbies down here that I'd never have during the week. So, and I think we'll actually see that going forwards into future years in what you've got. We need to have a look how organisations reconstruct and review how work is actually done. And in that, what I mean is, if we're looking to identify the most important processes and how we've actually develop our professional consultants and our staff through the different stages of a project, and how we can actually apply that with reduced actual interaction time directly face to face. We need to consider whether there's small elements of mentorship and need to be undertaken in an office, or can that be done digitally? And we need to sort of consider the processes and cultural interactions of us as an actual office space and working community. I think potentially there's the chance to see extended remote outsourcing of staff. They don't necessarily have to be geographically related, but then you've got to balance that with how much time you really do want them in the office. So that's my sort of take on the office. Now, if I can go more into restaurants and bars and retail side of things, in terms of the people side in restaurants, the average spend in a restaurant per week or outdoor takeaway type space is actually £14, just over. That figure is likely to fall and probably half, they reckon, this year, and that could be a trend moving forward. We're all eating at home a little bit more. They say 20% of diners will return to the restaurant that use the eat out to help out, that wouldn't have actually probably visited before on those. When on the eat out to help out, we saw Monday to Wednesday spending up 34% in August compared to July. So that's a vast increase. And I saw something like that contributed something like £250 million worth of revenue back to the government through that scheme in what they've actually done. But what people were doing with that was they were actually eating more. The bills were roughly the same price overall, even though you were getting a £10 discount. So people were actually consuming more on that Monday to Wednesday. Deliveroo, through the last 6 months, has actually seen a 36% increase in their orders. Now, that's not just coming on a Friday and Saturday night. They're actually seeing increases in people wanting deliveries for breakfast and deliveries on lunch. So we're actually sort of consuming food away from the restaurant space in what we're doing. The actual lunch was actually 80% increase, with 50% for breakfast. We're actually seeing consumer preferences towards health in healthy and sustainable food in what they're looking for in terms of value for money. And what they're saying is 25% of consumers say that they've changed their diet over the recent past. Now that could be more vegan based. It could be just more healthier and sustainable lunch times. In terms of your physical restaurant space, what we need to do is review in how they're being used at the moment. In terms of rental agreements, what we're likely to see is much more leases coming on board with related to turnover rent rather than just a flat rent. What we're looking for is that actually there's 30% of the restaurants at the moment on the high street are vacant. That's a long-term trend which preceded COVID. And every day I'm still reading of more and more CVAs coming through for people shutting restaurants. Pizza Hut was the latest today with 49 shuts. In the last recession, 200 restaurants were actually handed back to landlords. That was in 2017, 2018. There was 200 restaurants were actually handed back. This is going to be closer probably to 3 or 4 times that. I think in terms of looking forwards now on what we've got, brands will now start introducing roadside pickups. They're looking for more delivery and an order online. So you're going to see more of a roadside presence from a restaurant. You're going to see an expansion in what they term dark kitchens for delivery. We've seen that already, and sort of central cooking hubs and borrowing of kitchens from restaurants as well during times of the day or times of the week. If we're looking in terms of new startups and new independents, at the end of this, they will flourish because there's going to be a lot of opportunity for them and space for them. If you look at the last recession in Spain, they had a massive increase in what they term mama and papa restaurants opening up, new independents coming through. And that was all geared through empty restaurants where you could get more independent people into them. You'll see an increase in private dining spaces and subdivision of restaurants, and you'll see the flows through restaurants changing. I think, as an aside, if you're looking at a business model, if you look at Costa Express, where they're serving just their coffee on a pickup, literally on a contactless and automated service, that will be a new model moving forwards, and we'll see more of coming into the roadsides. And also changes in adaptation into sort of HVAC installations and virus spread. We're already seeing lots more HEPA filters and that sort of thing coming through. In terms of digital, we've got an implementation of contactless delivery. we're seeing that with the orders that are coming through. But what we're actually seeing on the flip side of that is not the entire menu being able to be utilised or delivered, because some things just don't travel well, and you've got to consider liquid containers and things like that. We're seeing an increase in cashless venues through contactless card payments rather than cash, an increase in click and collect. And then what we're seeing is a redefined sort of digital communication with loyalty programs and personalizations and things like that coming through. So that's the sort of in-app ordering and actual acknowledgement of what you're doing, and similar to what Tesco's or anyone else like that would do as a retail store. In terms of leases, we've already said we're moving over towards sort of turnover rent in terms of our supply chain. And what we're looking to do is use more of our food in terms of what it is to actually redefine what you've got going through. In terms of staffing, guests are sensitive to hygiene, and they're sensitive to what something looks like. So if it looks messy, that translates to being an unclean kitchen. You will lose your customer and actually look moving through from there. You know, food is not a work from home industry, so there's a lot more exposure to risk in terms of what you've got there. So what restaurateurs are doing, they're splitting work teams into bubbles and moving forwards in that way in terms of how they actually work. So that was very, very quickly restaurants and how things will change. What you'll actually get is things like kitchen spaces. Now with takeaway counters, you'll end up with an increased kitchen space dedicated to off-site sales than what you will in-site. And what you're also seeing is less stock turnover and less stored food within the areas. Sorry, if I can just roll through into retail. I'm conscious of time for everyone as well, sorry. UK retail sales have actually stayed pretty much where they were pre-COVID. They've actually increased 3.2% compared with July last year on a like-for-like in July this year. But what you have seen is the split from sales went from something like 20% online right the way up to 50% in July, and it's dropped back down to about 42% since. A lot of that relates to people buying shopping online. Your Sainsbury's, your Tesco's, your Morrisons and things like that coming through. In terms of a physicality for retail sales, forward-looking companies are actually redefining the role of their stores, and they're streamlining their operations. What you're seeing is less shelf space, it's less stock stored, but what you're seeing is more of a showroom and more easier to shop and bits like that. You're seeing stores used to offer you sort of unique in-store experiences. So I've worked for like Adidas and people like that, and they became literally a showroom for their major stores. We're literally a showroom for you to go in, experience what you're looking at digitally online. And I think that is going to move forward in their actual business model, in that you become a showroom. You can order online to get your delivery tomorrow of what you've just looked at one on the actual physical side of the store. Automation becomes a little bit more necessary in what we're doing. So you're seeing doors being opened automatically, you're seeing self-checkout, you're seeing remote management, and you're seeing the sort of scheduling and sort of upscaling of stock levels and that sort of thing all being held within your store. I think we were already looking with Adidas about 18 months ago at vending opportunities within stores, and you'll probably see a lot more of that sort of thing coming through as well. You'll see the stores turning into mini distribution centres. I don't know about you, but my local Morrison's up the road now is doing a lot more distribution, I think, through Amazon. I think it is that they're actually using for pickup there. You'll get more roadside pickup and buy online, pickup in store features, and you'll see more integrated sort of technology in what you're coming through in terms of artificial intelligence and voice activation within stores. So you're reducing the level of touch in what you've got. You'll be encouraged to use more self-service and self-scanning, and store designs which need to consider the limited sort of touch points in what you've got with that. What you think about is with increased sort of social distancing requirements, that does reduce your stock availability space down because you're having to space more people away. In terms of digitally, great. In terms of digitally, the adopted sort of accelerated e-commerce. Amazon's actually 35% up compared to the same period last year in terms of their trade. You're seeing a migration away of sales from stores to e-commerce, and you're seeing in-store spaces and connected spaces sort of providing experience rather than pure stock that they would have done before. And I think we'll start seeing a lot more digitized returns process. In terms of the supply chain, we're sort of shifting the sort of complexity upwards in terms of replenishment and tagging and labeling. I think those sort of items are all being done off store now at centralized warehouses before they're actually being sent out. So your stock controls and that, because they can be monitored automatically, are coming through there, providing sort of real-time inventory solutions. And finally, in terms of staffing, yes, we're building in PPE into the stores to protect our workers. You see the obvious sneeze guards and screening, but the way that stores will be designed will change running through. That was a very, very quick gabble through of how I see restaurants, retail and offices changing as we are at this very moment, and how we could be moving forwards. I hope that was okay.
That was brilliant. Thank you so much, Julian. It was really insightful trends and thoughts about how the office space, restaurants and retail are changing and shifting, and the trends that you've seen as well, like over the past years compared to this year. I think we've probably got time for one question, and then we can take further questions at the end of all the presentations. Has anybody got a question that they would like to ask Julian? I haven't seen anything on the chat, but is there any?
I've just seen Lisa's just came through with one. She said, given the adjustment to, hello Lisa, thank you for your question. Given the adjustments to restaurants to separate diners more safely, what are the immediate long-term implications to restroom WC facilities to complement this? I think what you've got to look at is the customer journey to those. You're not going to have less toilets. You're not going to have you're still going to need that requirement through there, but I think that customer journey, we're going to have to increase the spacing that you get through, so you'll no longer have that table set right on the toilets, which is probably that last table that you really want in the restaurant, but you're not going to have that. I think you're going to end up losing a set of covers and that sort of thing coming through. You're going to see increased cleaning, certainly long term, coming through, and the type of finishes that you use in that space. Does that answer the question, Lisa? Is that all right? Or
I was going to say, I get the impression that we're moving towards more unisex WCs now, as opposed to gender separated WCs, to try and address what is essentially a shortfall in space to accommodate the same, a number of diners, sort of thing.
No, certainly in terms of restaurant design, we have favoured in more recent years to go to unisex toilets, purely because of the cut down in space that we need, or that generates by having it with the single lobby and cubicles that run through.
Yes.
Thank you. I'll be interested to see as well, in terms of the increased requirement for ventilation, how many landlords are going to pay for that, or whether they will pass those costs on to the tenants.
In some ways, it's quite easy to address. In other ways, it's a little bit more difficult. You can get packs which are literally set within the existing ducts that we've got there, that will actually filter out the vast majority of the problems within the airflow there. There's some very good articles and pieces which have come through in the last sort of 6 months on how we can actually do that. There's a vast amount of ways, things like HEPA filters that we've put into like medical facilities and that sort of thing. I think you'll start seeing more of into like restaurant areas, and there'll be that communication of the advanced filtration and ventilation coming through will then try and encourage you into that space to make you feel comfortable.
Yeah, it's been interesting times, but thank you so much for your insightful thoughts and trends. If anybody else has any questions, please do think of your question, put it in the chat, and we'll come back to the question at the end of the other presentations. So I'd now like to introduce James Ward, Associate Director at Arup. James Ward is a qualified architect and an Associate Director. He has extensive experience of commercial offices and workplace design, working with a diverse range of clients. So Arup are going to give us an overview of the office space and whether it's safe to work in and how people are moved around, and introduce us to Arup's Space Explorer, which brings together intelligent modelling and simulation of people's movements within the office space. So welcome to James.
Hi everyone. So I'm going to give you a very much more focused talk than Julian's quite wide-ranging talk. I did a little introduction, if you just go to the next slide, but I think Anna's covered that quite comprehensively, is that I'm an architect and I work for Arup, and I have a background designing, working for lots of, on commercial offices, working for lots of corporate clients, both in the UK and worldwide. And as you may or may not know, Arup is a large multinational company. Obviously, we've got a big presence in the UK. But I think one thing we are getting, and I'll be totally honest with you, this COVID experience is a complete learning curve for us. But our global reach, if you like, does give us quite a big perspective on various offices around the world. And obviously lots and lots of countries are at different stages of this pandemic. East Asia is almost effectively emerged from it. And different countries also have very different rule sets. So you'll be probably well aware about social distancing. In this country, we always talk about 2 meters, 1 meter. And different countries have different rules, whether it's 1.5 meters, 6 foot, 1 meter. And increasingly, we're seeing quite a lot of that in Arup, and we're beginning to build a body of experience. So if you go to the next slide, please, Anna, thank you. And obviously, like, there's just massive media interest. There just seems to be this insatiable appetite for this. This was just some articles I pulled off the press yesterday. And the big question on everyone's lips is bringing people back to the office. And as Julian says, like, planning spaces is really, really important. And I think if we are going to design our buildings and design our workspaces to be more resilient, we've got to think a lot harder about this going forward. And if you like, we need to start thinking now about tool sets that can address the problems that we've got today, but also potentially as we redesign and reimagine the workspace, we've got to think hard in the future. And just next slide, please. And again, this is a huge learning curve for me. Myself have been involved in a huge amount of this media coverage. And one thing I've noticed, you have to be so cautious when you're talking to the media about things like this, because people want the headline. They want this very simplistic, it's going to be dangerous. Is it going to be dangerous? Is it going to be unhealthy? And there's all kinds of questions about air conditioning, for example, which, from sitting in lots and lots of meetings with lots and lots of global experts on this, there aren't absolutely clear answers at the moment. There isn't a specific absolute position on whether things make a difference and what we can do to affect this. But one thing I think is almost unanimous, that social distancing is a good thing. And most countries, most guidance, almost everything talks about social distancing as a really, really important aspect of modern workplace. And increasingly, sorry, next slide, please, Anna. As we come back to the new normal, I think we're going to have to think a lot harder about how we effectively, I don't like to use the term, but cram people into spaces, because I think everyone will probably be aware who deals with commercial offices that there's been increasing trends to increase densities. I think Julian was citing an office that he's been involved in where previously they would put in significantly more people than they would have done today. And that's very much been a trend. And its question is that trend going to persist, or are we going to think differently? And next slide, please, Anna. And obviously, the UK government, I'd love to say they're really, really clear. I don't think they're so clear, but there are some fairly clear rules that really maintaining 2 meters social distancing is very, very important. But also, where people can't be 2 meters apart, managing transmission risk is really, really important. And the government, I think, in a lot of their early guidance talks about one really, really important aspect of that is as people move around. Because everyone knows who's like effectively walked along a country path. There are just times when you just can't get out of people's way. You can't maintain that 2 meters. And so it's how long are you going to spend in that proximity? And social distancing is important on a number of levels. Like, there's the transportation level where people are coming into the office. There's building entry, there's lifts and stairs, and in the workplace. And managing that transition is very, very important. Now, obviously, the transport infrastructure side of it is very complex. And whilst we do look at that in Arup, I'm not going to look about that today. But I'm going to talk about everything after that in the process. And so what Arup has done is, we call it Space Explorer, and it's probably not as exciting as it sounds, but we've developed an app essentially where we can take clients' layouts and we can analyze them to understand the social distancing requirements in their office. But also we can leverage, and I'll talk more about what this is in a minute, what's called Arup's mass motion software to understand much better how people move around that space. And really, we're trying to answer a number of questions for clients, because there's a question about how many people can safely work in the office. I mean, I think that question to some extent can be answered to some extent by FM teams looking at their own spaces. But then how will people interact, and how do I rebuild confidence? And what we find interesting is that certain offices, we can find instances where there's far greater degrees of exposure of certain individuals than other degrees of exposure, and getting a consistency of fairness, if you like, in the office is really, really important. And obviously,
Exactly.
this is really, really important in terms of how people are sitting on the floor plate. And people have, if you like, they take up a certain physical space. So often when you see retail units and things and they've done dots on the floor, real people aren't that like that. Real people actually take up volume. And that becomes much, much more significant when you go to 1 meter social distancing as opposed to 2 meter social distancing, because people are that much closer together. The tolerance, if you like, is much, much tighter. So what Space Explorer basically does is we take a client's layout and we effectively rebuild it in this application we've got, if you go to the next slide. And then we use quite a sophisticated algorithm to work out the optimized seating based on the current desk arrangements. And if necessary, we have algorithms that can replan your desks to suit the optimum occupancy based on social distancing. And what we're finding some fairly consistent statistics around the world where we've got different rules we're working to, is that if you go to 2 meter social distancing with typical desks, you end up, I think, at about third occupancy. It's quite a well understood figure. If you move it to 1 meter and you keep your desks as they are, and obviously there are constraints as to why you can keep the desk because of floor boxes and data connections, you normally get up to about 55%. It's a very sort of pretty consistent figure. You can, though, go well beyond that. You can actually, even in some cases, if you start planning desks into your breakout space, get back up to 100% at 1 meter social distancing. But obviously that has quite a big impact on interactions. So what we can do, next slide please, is we can obviously quickly test layouts for clients. And then if you go to the next slide, a tool that we've developed as well is a tool that allows you to look at your teams and map adjacencies between those teams. So for example, if you've got the admin team and the HR team and they may need to interact, and then plan your desks for a whole building based again on another quite sophisticated algorithm, and then map that data into the movement software so you can understand how your teams are going to interact. In the old days, oddly, impromptu interaction between business units would have been seen as a really positive thing. Today, it isn't, but nevertheless, we never know. We might come back to the fact where it's actually seen as a positive thing. Now what we try and do is Arup actually already has, and we've had it for quite a long time, we have a very sophisticated program called Mass Motion. And we tend to use this to model things like transport interchanges, fire escape scenarios from buildings, etc., etc. And what it does is it models the behavior of people moving around. And there's quite a lot of research that's been going on since the 1970s that models and understands how people move through space. And you can start applying basically statistical probabilities. What you can see then is a scenario, for example, where we have an entrance condition in an office, and we can start modeling how people move and interact through that space, and when they potentially come into proximity to it with each other, when they can't avoid it or not. Because essentially what we've done is we've taken Mass Motion and we've updated it so that the agents effectively do what people try and do in real life, and basically just try and avoid each other. And so this is a really, really key tool, I think, as to how we can look at offices. So the next example shows you the example of reception. Now, Boris Johnson is spending a lot of time telling people he wants them to come back to work, and you often see these images of Canary Wharf where there's these very, very tall buildings. And obviously social distancing impacts on lifts and lift capacities. And if I'm honest, I've dealt with it for many years. Those buildings already have problems with their lifts because people have occupied them more densely than they were designed for. So you're effectively going to get quite big queuing issues. And you may well, as many people are, introduce things like temperature scanning. And you need to think about how people are going to move through your reception so you can keep them safe and inside, because a really critical question is soon going to become, how many people can you tell to come back to your office at any one time without them effectively queuing up, for 200 yards down the street? And Mass Motion, using Mass Motion and lift simulation and Space Explorer, we can basically set up those simulations. So what we then do is this is our own offices in London, is we produce effectively these heat maps, and we have a different color scale. And the color scale, if you go to the next slide, maps the time in proximity that people spend. And that's counted as seconds in a day. Now, at the moment, there isn't a definitive view on how long people spend with each other. That some countries like Ireland, for example, talk about 15 minutes as a kind of a key metric. But nevertheless, there's always the potential that someone sneezes on someone, or someone just comes into contact and then they leave something where someone can get COVID. And what we notice, you can see it quite clearly here, is that, it's almost common sense that people at the end of the desks near aisles are more exposed, obviously, because I've got people passing past them, than people who sit near windows. But then more interestingly, I think, is that what you can start seeing is that there's certain points in the office, and this particularly is in our office, it'd be very easy to say, okay, so we just leave off all the end desks. But then if you do that, you lose an enormous amount of capacity. But you can find the real pinch points in an office using our simulation. So basically what we can do is we can simulate using the software, the movement of people between areas like the toilets, the lifts, the breakout spaces. And we basically apply effectively probabilities that people are going to, for example, go to the toilet or go and make themselves a cup of tea in the kitchen. And we agree those parameters with a client, although we tend to find they're fairly standard in terms of their level of acceptance. And then what we can do is we can model the space. And what this allows us to do is, and I think this is where it's quite pertinent to the clients that we've spoken to, because we're doing this all around the world at the moment, is that certain colleagues have a much greater risk potentially than other colleagues, which is a slightly uncomfortable position to be in. And what we tend to do then is replan locally areas to mitigate those risks. So going forward, I wouldn't be at all surprised if what we're looking to do is replan offices in a much more resilient way. And then the classic model that we've got at the moment of what tends to happen is people tend to put the desks very densely in certain locations in the office and then create lots and lots of breakout space might be disrupted, because obviously the difficulty with that is that can be quite problematic from maintaining a social distancing thing and maintaining kind of the risk of infection spreading between people. What we then do, and this is my last slide, is we can then produce effectively a matrix of options for a client. So, clients, these are quite nuanced decisions, and people are, I think, only now really beginning to bring the kinds of people, the levels of people into their office, or at least think about it, where there's really an issue. If I'm completely honest with you, having done this for a while now, there isn't really a big issue at 33% occupancy, which is 2 meter social distancing. In a sense, it's very effective at maintaining issues around movement. But as soon as you move to 1 meter, and a lot of countries in the world already have this 1 meter, your occupancy is going up, your density of people's going up, and so consequently, you do start noticing these hotspots. And these areas where certain people are unfortunately going to get are more at risk than others. And what we then try and do is, obviously we try and either locally admit these or replan areas, but we try and do a kind of generally, I would say for clients, but at the moment we tend to do a de minimis approach, because most people don't want to invest in moving around all their infrastructure. I suspect going forward, and we've just started doing this on new builds, is that people will want to start thinking about exactly how their offices might work with social distancing, because there's always a risk this might come back. There's always a risk that something's going to happen in the future. And by developing these kind of techniques and simulation techniques, hopefully we can give clients an insight into the kind of issues that they might experience. And that's my last slide. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, James. That was really fascinating, seeing that model and how it works. For me, it was interesting as well, because I know that there's been talks about you can pass somebody and that the transmission rate is very low. It's literally when you stop to talk to somebody for 15 seconds or longer,
yeah,
when the rates can go up and everything. So unless people are stopping talking to colleagues, that could increase.
Yeah, I mean, there's degrees of issues clearly, and all we can do, to be honest, is we're not scientists, and I can't specifically tell you about the risks of certain environments. And if I'm totally honest, having seen a lot of research and sat in a lot of meetings in this, I don't know that there's any definitive view about things. I mean, the Irish government, I think, is one of the clearest, and they say 15 minutes. If you haven't been with someone for 15 minutes, don't really worry about it. What I think is clear, though, is that social distancing, whatever metric you apply to it, is a really good thing. And I mean, I'm no COVID expert, but obviously that there are definite issues with spending time with individuals, but also there may be instances where, for example, people are going along, they might sneeze, they might, breathe on someone. I don't think anyone's really sure. So all we're trying to do is, we can't comment as architects or engineers, or in my company, on the medical research behind this, a bit like air conditioning. But what we can do is suggest mitigation measures to the best of our ability, and the one that this tool focuses on is that social distancing problem. And we're trying to do that not only when you're sitting down, but also when you're moving.
Thank you. We have got time for a couple of questions, and then we can reserve other questions to the end. I can see that Lisa has put a question in the chat saying surely breakout spaces will be more important rather than using to increase capacity going forward so that people can interact safely, especially as much work will be done working from home, and the office is likely to be used more precisely for those interactions rather than just straight desk working.
No, to be honest, Lisa, that's a very, very good point. And if I'm completely honest with you, the reason we've modelled the desks and all the examples I'm showing you at the moment is simply that's just what people have got at the moment and what they're coming to us with. And most commonly, clients are saying to us, can you check our, like the first premise of them is, can you check where we are today? And I don't think many clients are quite in the position where they're totally thinking radically. But I'm sure what you're saying is absolutely right, that you will start wanting to model and understand the breakout space, because that's where, as you say, the interaction is really going to happen. That's where your point, Anna, where people potentially might spend long periods of time together. And again, all these things, to be honest, we could build into our modeling and our assumptions. This is the only reason we haven't done much of that yet, simply because I just don't think people are quite there. That, so many people in the city are only in Arup, we're only, I think, at 10% at the moment. I mean, we've barely begun on this journey.
Yeah, I know that there's still concern and anxiety about people travelling back into London or into the city. There's still a lot of people working from home. So whether that will change in the next few months, we shall see. Does anyone else have any questions at all? Yes, Lisa.
Surely with taking on board Julian's comments and yours, James, has any work been done on the cost per desk at, say, a 2 metre? Because when you talk about, that much reduced capacity, clearly that is going to affect leases. It's going to affect overheads considerably. Yes. And between the two of you, they're obviously these algorithms should churn this stuff out, I suppose.
Well, there's a very interesting dilemma. I don't think I can answer your specific question, but I can answer a question that's related, I think. Is that when you're at 2 metre social distancing, most desking modules don't work. You are effectively pulling people well apart. But at 1 metre, actually, on our assumptions, we tend to assume a person is about half a metre big. A 1.6 desk makes quite a significant distance to the capacity that you can get in versus a 1.4. And I think if you all know, everyone is moving, or certainly we are in Arup, we've moved to a 1.4 module. So we can get more people in. And we've actually, the first client we had in India actually, and they are literally procuring their furniture as we speak. And there's a really big dilemma for them, I think, about whether they go to actually physically bigger desks, which I don't think help you at 2 metres. I think to some extent at 2 metres, it's so onerous that, it's very hard, I think, to plan for. But at 1 metre, it is a real dilemma, I think. And I think it does pose a real dilemma, because as you say, companies are very conscious of their cost per desk. They're very conscious of that, and and most companies, the trend has been to go to I'd say 1.4 is a fairly common UK desk at the moment, where 1.6, 1.8 is a little bit old school. And I wonder whether people will move back. And of course, that means less breakout, back to your point. That, if you want to put the same number of people, you've just got less breakout, haven't you? And maybe that's not really what we want anymore, because as you say, most people are going to work in home. So perhaps it's better just to have less bigger desks and more and maybe more breakout. It's a real dilemma, I think.
It is a dilemma, and I think there is that need to have that social interaction, and for people to go back to the office space. But then when you're looking at some of the larger offices, as you mentioned in London, some of the multi-storey buildings with lifts, or even if you're looking at venues, hotels locally, the issue is going to be about mass meetings. And this is why at the moment we're having to have this virtual forum here, because the logistics of getting people through the door,
I know.
a mass group, and then where you sit down and having bubbles and things like this is at the moment not.
And I think people haven't quite cottoned on to how big a problem this is, because lifts simulation, not to bore people, is quite precise and relies on certain capacities. And if you've got a 40-storey building, which you would in Canary Wharf, say a 30, 40-story building, you cannot have people walk up the stairs. It's just impossible. And so they have to take the lift. And I can't tell you who it is. We had a bank pre-crisis who was having 10-minute wait times for their lifts at certain times of the day in the morning because they had over-occupied their building. And they were like, Arup, what can we do about that? Imagine the problem they're going to have when they can only get 4 people versus 21 in a lift, or 16. And the queues, because the limiting factor we find when we do the simulation isn't the lift, it's the queue. It's keeping people in the dry in a safe environment, you know, and that's actually where the movement software is quite good, because it can determine the queue length.
And now with new measures being put in place from next Monday in terms of groups of no more than 6 people.
Yeah.
So that's just going to complicate it even more moving forward.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, James.
No problem.
Thank you. I'd now like to introduce our third speaker today, Stuart Scott, who's the director at Co-Living Spaces. So Stuart is a multi-award winning property developer, a serial entrepreneur and speaker. He won the highly prestigious 2019 UK Property Developer of the Year and 2018 UK Property Investor of the Year awards for his work to pioneer change in the property market. His company, Co-Living Spaces, has been at the forefront of the co-living movement in the UK, inspiring many trends now popular in shared living. So Stuart's going to give us an update on the co-living and co-working transforming the way we work and live. So over to you, Stuart. Yeah.
So actually, it's really fascinating actually getting those two perspectives actually on the two previous talks, because obviously I'm coming at this from the developer side. So we're a developer, we've got commercial and we've got residential, we've got hotels. We build, you know, we develop, we, you know, convert, we build, and, you know, we're providing the accommodation for, I guess, for a lot of people on this webinar's employees. So this is a different kind of perspective, but hopefully what I can share with you is how some of the trends are changing in the work-life balance, where these guys were talking about, you know, the work side of things. Well, now there's actually a lot of change that's happened in the last 5-6 years in the life, you know, in the live part of that. And so I identified a trend probably about 6-7 years ago, where people were moving into kind of like shared living and, you know, these new types of kind of city urban living. And so we've kind of invested heavily in that. And I can share with you how we've started to blur the line between live work and how that might impact into what the previous two speakers were saying in how you are balancing your employees moving between where they live and when they work. So I'll just dive into for you. So my background is I built and sold creative agencies in Brighton and Hove. So the thriving kind of tech sector that we've got in Brighton. You know, I've had the employees, the big offices that everyone's just described, you know, they all complained about they couldn't get decent accommodation. And so when, you know, I sold my previous agency and then I moved full-time into property development. And so about, say, 6 years ago, something like that, I moved basically all of my knowledge from tech innovation and I pivoted it across into the property sector to solve the problem that was there, which was decent quality accommodation that was more in line with millennials and Generation Z. You know, so Generation Z, say 20 to 25, we don't really rent to anyone below that, and then millennials going all the way up to say 45, and then you kind of got the slightly older demographic above that. But you know, there's a lot of quality issues for the way, you know, some of that accommodation is available in Brighton and Hove and Worthing, Eastbourne, and across the southeast. So that was something we wanted to address. So this is a company, Co-Living Spaces. We didn't set out to create a property company. We set out to create an innovation company, exactly the same as the companies that we built before. The only difference now was instead of building products, we were building physical buildings from the ground up or converting them. One of the first areas that I moved into was the HMO industry. Now, for those of you that have heard of HMOs, they've had a bit of a bad reputation for many years. You'd probably think of student HMOs and everything else, you know, parties, low quality, noise issues, antisocial. Now, here's the interesting thing. Shared living is really important. It's part of the density of when we build and develop our cities and our towns. And this area of the market, shared living, is hugely important to basically any of us before we settled down and had children, and before we wanted to go into a 1-bed flat or a 2-bed flat. So it's hugely important, and it's been an undeveloped area, which is why we wanted to disrupt that part of the market. And so what we did is back in 2015, we started championing this new wave of co-living. And what we do is we convert commercial and large buildings into co-living. These are existing buildings, whether we're adding onto them, we're adding more units on them, we're developing them, usually commercial. So, quite timely. A lot of the stuff that's happening at the moment in commercial, we're actually converting a lot of and repurposing a lot of commercial stock across into residential. We've got a chain of smart hotels in central Brighton, and we do build up from the ground up as well in land and site stuff as well. So co-living is about the space that we create. That's the product. The physical space is where your employees will be living. The community that we provide, which of course HMOs never really did that before, and the experience, the full end-to-end experience, because the actual product, the way you live, has completely changed. And whereas before a landlord would have spliced and diced a building, rented them out, tenant's a problem, generally no service element to it at all. What you're seeing is convergence of the hotel industry, the concierge service-based industry, across into the housing industry. So, for example, housing as a service. So, one of the things that we do with shared living, and actually, before I dive into this, one of the things I will mention was a lot of people probably think that, well, with shared living, obviously that would be a real problem during COVID. Now, interestingly, we across the whole portfolio, across the Southeast, we did have a few people that had to go into isolation and various other things. But it acted very similar to the within your family. If someone got ill, everyone in the house or the building has to isolate. But what we did find was there's a lot of people that didn't have as much isolation because they kind of almost had the unit, so they had the support and everything else that was within there. So they had a kind of like certainly for mental health and well-being, they had that support network. And then when I share with you in a minute the facilities and everything we put in there, it's meant that we've been very well placed to provide space for this change that's now happened into not only live work, but this new post-COVID world that we start to move into. So we've got an emphasis on the community spaces. So unlike, for example, the traditional HMOs, we really focus on creating these big shared spaces that people can use, that we've taken a lot of the learnings from the retail sector. So I remember the first speaker was talking about retail fit outs. I'm sure he'll recognize some of the principles that we've taken from retail fit outs into what we now create in our social spaces. So go back 5-6 years ago, we took our learnings from the commercial world, we started to apply that in. And so we used a lot of zoning, we used a lot of flow, we designed for the flow of people, and we used a lot of commercial principles to create these spaces that were more akin to a retail experience than they were actually just a living experience. And the reason we did that is because we're not replicating the family home. These people don't know each other. We're bringing them together, and this is about a social lifestyle, inspiring spaces they want to hang out in and they want to socialize in. So what we've done over the years is we've created a whole range of these kind of open social spaces, which form the basis of being able to have spaces to dine together if they want to, spaces to we have, whether that's cinema rooms, whether that's games rooms, whatever facilities we're building in, this is a world away from the kind of dated HMOs that have been on the industry for so long. And you can start to see how we have created a whole range of these spaces. And these ones that I'm showing you here, these are across Eastbourne, Worthing, Brighton, Hove, and across the whole Southeast. And we have applied very similar thinking into how we design and lay out these spaces so that people can there's multiple hobs, there's multiple cooking facilities, there's plenty of storage, there's multiple fridges, there's freezers. All the facilities they need are all kind of included within this space. Now, where this starts to get really interesting beyond just that part of the living, and in the context of this, this webinar, is where we start to move into something we started probably about 3-4 years ago. We started to notice that some of our customers worked from home 1 or 2 days a week. So what we did as developers is, rather than cram more rooms in, because we'd already done our development on the building, so we'd recycled a lot of our money. So financially, we had already stacked our projects, so the deal's stacked anyway. So every project that we do is, as a developer, you have to serve a certain number stack. We found that we could actually increase the room sizes and increase more facilities as an experiment. So it was about 3 years ago, to put co-working into co-living. Now, this was because we could see there was a trend moving to flexi working. And obviously that in COVID, we've been oversubscribed for people who want to live in these environments because they can work from home. We provide co-working within the co-living spaces. So just to be clear, this isn't co-working where they're paying any more for it. This is where we are helping facilitate the overall experience of living within the co-living community. And we've seen, so just as the retail world, the other guys we're talking about, is changing, we as the living experience are changing as well. And we can see that people are spending more time at home and they need access to more facilities. So these kind of facilities I'm showing you here are now provided across a lot of our sites, because we've realized that, not only was it an emerging trend before, I think someone at the start talked about this being an accelerator of existing trends. Absolutely. This was, because we're an innovation company, we were constantly experimenting. And because we were running these experiments, when we spotted the trends, now this trend has accelerated it. It's kind of put us in a good position to not only be oversubscribed for what we've got, but to invest in all the future ones as well. So we have a whole range of these co-working spaces that are built into the living environments. So here's another example. This is one in Central Hove, I think, where we've got completely, we've designed different areas and zones and all the various architectural bits that you would put in, big workstation spaces, and depending on what and how they want to use and work in the space, they can use the open plan area, they can go into the smaller breakout areas, or we have little micro co-working as well. So, we have rooms, they're not legally big enough to be a bedroom. We basically convert these into adaptive use rooms where people can work out of them. Now, of course, the other thing I'll just mention as well, we have the fastest Wi-Fi going into the building that you can get, probably 350, 400 megabits a second. And we have access points across the building. Every corner of the building has access points, 100% signal, because we recognize that our customers are hyper connected. And, this trend between this flexi working is only going to be emerging more. So how does that break itself down? We have project stations in people's rooms. Now, we don't really expect people to just work from their room, because I don't know about you, but I'd go a bit crazy working out my room all day. So we have project stations. We do put them in. We also have the main co-working spaces, which is really the big open plan co-working areas where people can work. Remember, these people are in a bubble because they're effectively a family unit within their building. If we have a larger building of 20, 30 units, we subdivide the communities. So that gets around we don't have massive bubbles. We just have smaller bubbles. We have private workstation pods for deep work. So if someone just wants to put the headphones on and get some deep work done, we have those. And we have multi-use spaces as well. So the multi-use space is where we've deliberately designed some of the spaces used for lunch, breakfast, dinner into areas that you can hot desk out of as well. So again, your employees need these kind of spaces because we're finding that more and more of them are working from home, and some of them may even be working on a more flexi part-time arrangement as well. The other area that I want to share with you was, and this was something that I brought with me from the tech world, was the breakout spaces, which again the guys mentioned earlier. in the office world, we had endless breakout spaces. And as you can imagine, in the tech world, it's all bean bags and pool tables and all crazy stuff that, at the time was, that's what, the creators wanted. But what we do is we do the same in co-living. We have breakout spaces so that if everyone's in the kitchen and you're not feeling social, or you've got a friend over or whatever that is, you can go to a breakout space. Now, this becomes really important in the context of this live-work balance, because breakout spaces are designed to be multi-purpose. So you could work out of a breakout space. That's the whole purpose of them. The breakout spaces are for anything. So we build those breakout spaces into all of our projects using hallways and various other places. And so the way that we're adapting these spaces is kind of in line with what's happening with the customer. And that customer is obviously what's happening in the offices is changing, but what's happening with how people are living is changing as well. They're private spaces as well. Obviously shared living is all about community, but equally it's all about privacy. We take a lot of learnings from the hotel sector. My memory foam mattresses, mood lighting, blackout blinds, all the things you'd expect from a hotel experience, we build into the kind of living experience. It's just a few examples to show you some of the spaces we create. And another area that we invested in, probably about 4 or 5 areas years ago, and many landlords don't do this, is they really underuse the outside spaces. Now, from an architectural point of view, this is potentially a very large square footage of space that is overlooked by traditional landlords. And we look to create the same kind of experience. We tick the same boxes, whether that's hammocks, whether that's barbecue zones, whether that's dining, whether that's, chill out seating, plus we make sure that there's a booster that's for the Wi-Fi so that you can work on your laptop outside in the outdoor space. These considerations are really important. And it's the reason we've been able to almost have a waiting list of people who want to live in the spaces we create, because we care about what we're doing, and we put the same attention to detail the previous 2 speakers are doing into their retail world. We do it in the kind of the live, the live part of the world. But we're using similar principles. We're using data. We're using customer research. We're gathering that data and that research. Whether that's touch points, whether that's heat mapping, whatever that is, whether that user research that we bring in, we're gathering that so that we can design these spaces that are more akin with how people want to use them. Now, of course, when you think about COVID, this is why it pays to be innovating, pays to be one step ahead, because when things move into COVID, a lot of landlords will be suffering because of this, because they haven't innovated, they haven't invested in their product, and they don't care about the customer. And ultimately, that shift that we see from being more customer focused, what you're doing with the office place is about being customer centric. These changes are there. You need to have them in place. And we're doing the same thing with how people live. So ultimately, we're providing a social lifestyle that people are asking for. I always say to people, this is you before you settled down and had children. This is you before you went and got a 1-bed flat. We've all been there. I'm still friends with many of the people I lived with in shared living growing up in Brighton and Hove. And some of my, they're lifelong friends. So I think it's an important, when we design the cities of the future and the towns of the future, density is not going to be an issue that goes away. Sustainability is an important part, but also the way we live and the way we work is changing. And what we've tried to do is to apply innovation so that we can change the way people live. And that has slowly adapted over the years to become how they live and work. And then we're effectively supporting the office environment, because the office environment is becoming a hybrid environment where you're only partially there. And now we're supporting that by providing the kind of live spaces that perfectly balance between the 2 areas. So we focus on creating the best customer experience we can. And that's because the customer has been changing. The millennials and the emerging Generation Z. One thing I would just say as well, just a useful little statistic for you, we have a lot of applications for people who want to live in our co-living and co-working from people from Generation Zs, from 20 to 25, and you'd expect millennials, of course, all the way up to say 40, 45, But what you wouldn't expect as much was we get a high amount of people from, say, 35 to 50. And that's because, whether they're not all, naturally people think that's all divorcees and everything else, which is not really the case. You've got people that move to the area. They don't want to live on their own. As much as we talk about social distancing, humans need social interaction, and they need a support network, and they need a friendship network around them. So it will always have an important part to play. So we're very much about creating an experience, which means that we are innovating on the product, and we're understanding the customer, which is exactly what the previous two speakers were talking about. We're just in a slightly different area of the industry, and we're taking similar principles, an architectural and innovation level, to try and solve the problem and create that better experience, and also adapt it, because we've adapted through this whole process of COVID. We've got very stringent processes in the hotels, very stringent processes in the co-living. We have a lot of guidelines to become COVID secure, and you have to be on top of that. And that's why it was important for us to run the experience side of things as well as, so we're operations and we're development. So that's my final slide. So hopefully that's given you a different perspective of that's the workspace. But what happens, because obviously, bringing people out of the workspace is one thing, but only if they're supported somewhere else, because you can't push them out of the workspace and suddenly they're stuck in their bedroom all day. So hopefully that's shown you, look, this change isn't just happening on that side, it's happening on the way people live. And that you can start to see how that whole blending between the two will start to work.
Thank you so much, Stuart. That's been really insightful. And I was going to ask you the question about, not because this looked as if it was all aimed for young people that were really setting up and just starting on their career path and everything, but it could be for those that are a lot older as well, maybe looking for more affordable housing.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that. So there's two parts to that. So the first part is, at the moment, we keep everything as intergenerational living. We've had generally good feedback from that. In the future, you could start to see niching. We have toyed with doing specific co-living environments, specifically for, say, 35, 40 upwards. I'm sure those niches will happen. We haven't needed to do those niches till now because we've had generally good feedback. Those niches may happen. And I guess it depends where you are on different demographics of people that live there. So yeah, we haven't needed to do it. And also affordability. One thing I would just say on that is, so if you imagine you've got your employees renting a one-bed flat, well, let's say that was in Brighton. Let's say it's £1,000 plus bills. You've got £1,300 That's off of their earnings on a monthly basis. We had one lady who, she was working at a PR agency, very good job, PR agency. She was paying £1,300 a month, having not a very great social life because she was at home paying a rent, didn't want to spend much money. And then she moved into one of our rooms, which I think was about £750. She was saving a lot of money. And in the space of about a year and a half, she saved up enough money for a deposit. So there's an affordability issue here as well. That if you're living in an urban area, that, depending on what stage of life you're at, that, these facilities, what you're buying into is not just the room, it's the community, it's the supporting network around that, it's the facilities, and it's the whole experience. And just as the workplace is changing, the way you live is changing. And, we're seeing a blurring between the two lines. And, we're having to kind of adapt to that.
And we're definitely seeing a trend in terms of, whether businesses renew their office leases, whether they downsize, or whether they look at co-working spaces because some people want to continue working from home. We will see a complete shift in terms of the use of the office space, how that's redeveloped or reimagined, and how it can be redeveloped. Definitely.
Well, and also, I guess I've got the flip side view of this, which is, I guess, I'm one of those developers that is buying up quite a lot of commercial and converting it. So I appreciate that, there is a diversification of the high street that was always going to happen. I buy a lot of stuff on the high street and we convert a lot of it. And I do retain some commercial. And not everything is shared living. There's apartments, there's various other things. I do keep small units, and the reason I did that was because I felt that reducing units down to like ultra affordable, non-repairing lease, licenses that are more flexible, felt like the right move many years ago. And because obviously, as a developer, the money's really in the retail. Wasn't really in the retail. It was in the residential. So I appreciate that there's a different perspective here, which is our high streets are going to change, and I think these new flexi classes that are coming in for you to be able to choose what you do with your retail or your commercial will be hugely important in revitalising the high street. And then companies like ours will be kind of partnering with other companies where we basically build out the the co-living and the residential elements to what we're doing.
I have got a question that has come in, and it's whether your business has been helped or hindered by recent planning changes being promoted by government.
Well, obviously in Brighton and Hove we had Article 4 blanket across the city, so that wasn't so useful. But the planning guidance that's coming out. Well, you mean the changes to what Boris Johnson's build, and all of the PD and
yeah,
okay. There's some interesting things there. I mean, the extra kind of floors on top of like the blocks, blocks. That's interesting. I think the bit that's most interesting to us is probably what we're doing in the high street, and repositioning the high street to become a slightly different. The non-standard thoroughfare of the high street obviously will always need its shops, but the secondary, tertiary areas of the high street where developers like myself will be developing them and building, a new element of community services within there.
And we're likely to see the high street change as well if restaurants and cafes do not have the capacity, which they don't do, they won't do with social distancing, as in spreading out onto the pavements, getting those licenses so that they can operate and have outside seating to extend their space. So we're likely to see the high street change as well, whilst these restrictions are in place until there's any change in that.
I mean, I do think that a lot of what their government's talking about, the principles of trying to relax planning laws, I think is a good thing. It's a very good thing. It's overdue. It's way overdue. It's been too onerous. There's we've got big problems with density and being able to hit our housing targets. And as being someone who puts a lot of planning applications in, it needed disrupting. And this is, as you said before, this is an accelerator of existing trends.
Yeah.
We already knew it was a problem, planning. And it's taken this to shake it up a little bit. So who knows, out the back of this, we may get a more streamlined, easier planning system.
I've had another question that's come in, more of an observation that there are employees working at home still in their HMO small bedroom, despite, or desperate, should I say, to get back to the office for some actual space and social interaction.
Yeah, do you know, one thing I would say about that is my take on what I think will happen with offices. I think there'll be a massive trend to working from home and finding. I mean, no one wants to work out of the bedroom. I totally get that, but having these extra spaces, whether that's co-working, you might just go to a co-working, rent some space, or you happen to live in one of our spaces. But I think what will happen is this trend. Everyone will downsize, because lots of my colleagues have all got offices in central Brighton. They're all talking about getting rid of them. I think what will happen is everyone will get rid of a load of offices, downsize, and then what will happen is people will want to build the culture of the company again, and they want to get people back together. And a couple of years down the line, everyone will be going back into offices again, and it will be booming. I think that it will change, everything will change, but I think we are going to see a swing happening, because there's only so much culture you can build without bringing people in. I mean, you could argue, my previous company just has satellite offices. And so people come together for the workshops, the brainstorming, all that kind of stuff, and then they go off and do their tasks, and then they come back. So,
and there's lots of evidence as well that co-working space or being in the office actually helps improve mental health. Having that social interaction is so important, and that's what's been missing the last few months. And people have been desperate to get out and to see people and to talk to people. I mean, we've seen that in the office here, and people have been desperate to get back into the office.
Yeah, I think all of us kind of missing. You know, this is great. This is great technology. This has accelerated this use of this technology. And if there's a positive to come from this technology we're using right now, it will cut down needless travel. You know, needless travel for long distances will be cut down. But I do agree that there is definitely I crave proper face-to-face people time, like many of us do.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers today. I don't think I have any other questions. I'll just take a pause and see if anyone wants to raise.
Oh, actually, could I ask a question of James, if that's okay?
Yes, and I have seen another hand go up as well. So if you want to ask your question to James.
Yeah, James, very quick question. Your modelling that you do with your software,
Yes.
one of the stuff we've looked into is retail heat modelling. I know Julian does stuff in retail as well, and we've used it and experimented with a little bit of heat mapping to understand how people use what equipment they use and what's heating and what layouts. Are you effectively kind of using that same overhead heat mapping tech, and then you just wrap software into kind of do the modelling on top of that?
So there's two types of, I guess, heat mapping. One is like a detection thing. Actually, I'll be totally honest, I've had a thing from the BBC that they're interested in like monitoring people's movements and heat mapping, as we've been talking actually. But also there's what we're trying to do is simulation modeling. So ideally the two will correlate perfectly. But yeah, we do use mass motion quite a lot. For example, a really good example of that is like an airport retail, where you're almost deliberately, dare I say, trying to get people to take a slightly tortuous route so they go past all the duty free. And I guess my comment, and actually to this BBC thing, is that, you know, it's useful to be able to map your spaces after you've done them. I mean, that's good data set, and you can make changes to loose fittings. But also, what we're really trying to do with what I'm doing is try and understand it even before we've designed it. So, inevitably, a lot of what we're doing now is slightly retrospective, although people aren't back in the office. But I think going forward, you're right. And I think another point you made is really valid. By the way, I think the point about, at the moment, I think inevitably companies are going to be looking at their desk sharing ratios and think, I'm going to downsize, particularly the financials. But a lot of the very successful companies historically have invested quite a lot in office space, not so much for desking, but just for bringing people together. And I wonder whether there'll be a detrimental effect longer term for companies who go too far with the desk sharing. I think it's inevitable they're going to reduce it. It's just inevitable. But
no, I thought it's interesting.
It'll become damaging at some certain point, I think, a certain threshold.
I think certainly the heat mapping is interesting when you kind of, because my understanding of heat mapping from years ago was a lot of it was used similar back into Julian's world, where it's used for almost modelling retail, before the flow of people through retail, before you've even built or fitted out. Yeah. Would you say that that's something, Julian, from your perspective, that's the way you've used that heat mapping to kind of almost work out how retail is actually going to be laid out?
Not necessarily myself, but yeah, I've seen it used extensively in how it works through operationally within restaurants and retail. Yeah,
it's very interesting. Well, this is the new data world we live in. So, a data-rich world where we're using that data to make decisions. So it's very fascinating.
Definitely. Did I see a raised hand from Alan? Yes. Alan, do you want me to unmute you? Yeah, there you go.
I was just trying to support what Stuart was saying. When COVID struck, everybody in our office worked remotely bar one. And what's happened since then is that we've had a bit of a reorganisation of the business and brought in 4 new staff. And we found that we've had to all return to the office to get them embedded into the culture and to speed up their induction. Trying to do it remotely has proved to be a real problem. So I think in the short term, people working from home is great if it's your existing team and you've already got a culture. But when you start bringing in new people, it becomes very, very difficult, because when you're working remotely and you're new to a business, it's very difficult to know who to ask the question to when you don't know what's going on. Whereas when you're in the office, you can just look across the desk and somebody solves that problem for you quickly. So that's our experience, because the COVID coincided with a reorganisation of our business. So, we've experienced it at both ends.
So
I totally agree, Alan, because we've done exactly the same. We all worked remotely, bar one, for our export team. And because we've got some new people that have joined us in the membership team, we've slowly brought staff back. That way it can be, you know, making sure that they really understand what we do. And it's really important to have that social interaction and that communication internally for the new staff. So
interesting.
And what we forgot was that we had to introduce all the new people to all the existing staff, and that just got overlooked. And that was one of the feedback that we've had, is that, you know, people suddenly turn up on these sorts of screens, and the existing staff are thinking, who are they?
So it basically throws up an interesting question about onboarding.
Yes.
So, you know, you've got basically a COVID or post-COVID onboarding process that needs
absolutely
to
right. And we're still using the pre-COVID onboarding because nobody has really thought it through.
And I see Maria's just put a comment that this is for existing staff as well, because we all need that social interaction, bounce off ideas and have that communication. Yeah, definitely a valid point there.
I mean, I've just, you know, today had quite a tense meeting with 2 or 3 other people in the business about some social interaction that wasn't working in the office. And when you're trying to figure that out remotely, because the other 2 people were in the office, and me being the third party remotely, trying to get my brains around what was happening without looking at their body language and stuff like that, because one of the people involved got quite upset. It was very, very hard. So I think there's still a space for people working together in an office. It makes it work more smoothly, I think.
I agree. Yeah, definitely. We've come to the end of our webinar today, so I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of our speakers today. Been absolutely amazing. Some really insightful thoughts about the office space and co-living. I just also would like to mention some of our future events, so please do have a look at these, because we'll continue to have our networking events up until the end of the year as virtual events. So there's one on restructuring and redundancy, because we know that the furlough scheme is coming to an end. And we've got some updates from the Bank of England, HSBC, and the Director General from the British Chambers at our annual general meeting. The next construction forum is on the 6th of October, and it's all about the talented and diverse workforce. In terms of skills, I just wanted to let you all know that government has just launched a Kickstart scheme, which is for businesses to take on board a 6-month placement for a 16 to 24-year-old who is currently on universal credit, to give them the opportunity to work for a minimum of 25 hours at minimum wage over 6 months, and that is fully funded by government. They will also receive funding to help them with training and developing their skills. And the Sussex Chamber is acting as an intermediary, because unless you're a business that has 30 placements or more, you can't actually apply. So if you have 1 placement, or you've got 2 or 3, or you've got 5 placements, we will act as an intermediary, gather all of the placements for numerous businesses, and then submit that to Department for Work and Pensions on your behalf. So please do have a look at our website. That's on the front page of our website. And do think about taking on a placement to help you in your work, but to give them the opportunity to develop their skills and give them a better potential future in terms of looking for work. So I'll leave that as my parting comments. We will share all of the presentations and the video recording from today. So thank you once again.